This is my experience in so-called riding the rods back in the 30s there, or riding the freight trains, in other words. I had enough credits to graduate high school in February, and I didn't like school that well that I wanted to go anymore between February and June, and I was ready to leave, but my mother wanted to see me go through the graduation exercises, so I decided to stay until that June and graduate with a group. We were just coming out of the Depression at that time, and there was really nothing for a young fella to do back there in the way of getting a job or anything, and I had planned to leave as soon as I could and go to the West Coast. At the time, I had a cousin living with us who was about 10 years older. I was about 17, I believe, and he was about 27, and he had had some experience in working on the railroads there back in Michigan. When we left, of course, we didn't carry anything on us. We had a little sack, you might say, that fastened to our belt where we had our shaving equipment and extra pair of socks and stuff like that, but that's all we carried. And we did have a little bit of money. I forget how much. I think we had about $12 a piece when we started out. We had to go from Duluth across the Bay to Superior, where the big railroad yard was, to get on, and we went there starting late one afternoon there, 4 or 5 o'clock. And we were going to get a train there heading for Fargo, North Dakota. We finally found the train and waited for it till it got ready to move, and then found an empty boxcar and got in it. And I'll tell you, of course, you would sit down there with your legs stretched out and back up against the side of the boxcar, but it isn't very comfortable. The vibration of the boxcar makes your rear end just burn like everything. It's you have to get up quite often and walk around a little bit. We got as far as St. Cloud, Minnesota, and had to get off. Of course, you always have to get off whenever the train stops, or the railroad bulls, as they're called, will find you and kick you off. So we got off and kind of hid around there and waited for the train to leave again. When it did, we missed the boxcar, and we ended up in a gondola, one of these open gondolas that was loaded with angle iron. And that is a miserable place to get, because the vibration is so bad that you can't really sit on the iron there. It'll pinch you. And it's very, very difficult to stay on one of those gondolas there, especially loaded with angle iron like we had. Also, it wasn't too far back from the engine, and the soot that they blow out of the stack of the engine comes back and hits you, and there's a lot of little real small pieces of ash in it and clinkers, and man, they hurt when they hit you in the face. They really it really hurts. So that wasn't too good of a spot. But we finally made it to Fargo, and our plan was that every few nights to spend a night in some cheap hotel room so we could shower and clean up, maybe wash some of our clothes there in the basin and stuff like that. So we spent the night in Fargo and took off the next morning and got as far as what is known as Jamestown, North Dakota. The hobos call it Jimtown, and that was a miserable place. We got there in the late evening, and it stopped, and we got off, and it had been raining, and it was misty and foggy, And of course we didn't want to get too far from the train because we didn't know just when it was going to start to pull out again. But yet we had to keep hidden from the railroad bulls and everything, and boy, it was terrible. We lay underneath another train that was on the siding there to get out of the way in the rain and all that. And finally, I guess we'd spent a good 3 or 4 hours waiting, and finally the train started to leave. So we ran, and this time we got on a gondola, or on a flat car, I should say, that had one of these great big self-loading earth machines on it, and it was still raining and that, and the rest of the trip, which we'd get into Bismarck in the morning, was very miserable because we were wet, cold, and it was a miserable trip, I'll tell you that. And then when we got to Brisbane, or when we got to Bismarck, we got off the train, and we had to hide out, and there was a cattle car there. That's one of those that have the sides are just slatted and there's openings, and we got in there to hide, and they pulled it up alongside of a loading thing and started loading sheep in where we were. Well, we couldn't do anything. We couldn't get out, and the sheep, boy, they just jam them in there. In fact, it got so that we were just lying on the backs of the sheep. They were packed so tight. Finally, we got to the door there, and they stopped long enough where we could get out. And the railroad crew, as a rule, don't bother the hobos. It's the regular railroad bull or cop that is the one you have to look out for. Anyway, we got out of there, and we were just miserable there, wet and tired and everything else. And so we got there was an annex to the Bismarck Hotel, a kind of a cheap annex there, and we could get a room for 50 cents each. And so we went there to stay there and get some rest. And it happened to be the day that President Hoover was coming there to visit. And of course they were, the police, wanted to check with everybody and everything. So we got a room, and we were dead tired, and after we'd washed out some of our clothes and hung them up to dry, we went to bed and went to sleep. And I don't know how long we'd been asleep, but finally there was a beating on the door, and there were a couple of state troopers there wanting to know what we were doing there. Well, we told them we were just passing through and everything, and they came in, and I showed them I had a driver's license at the time and identified that and everything. And finally they said, okay, you get out, the sundown, you get out of here. And they were just about to go when they looked on the dresser, and I had an Elgin gold watch. My dad had known a fellow that had passed away, and this fellow left my dad this Elgin watch, and my dad had given it to me. And of course it had on the back, it had the name of this fellow, and which didn't jive with my driver's license. So he looked at that, and then there was a long hassle there that explaining how I got it with a name on it that wasn't mine. And I guess they were just about ready to haul us into the clink, but finally they said, okay, you can go. So they left, and we slept the rest of the day, and then went out toward evening there in the late afternoon to a hobo jungle, which was on the west side of Bismarck. Now when we got to this hobo jungle, which is in a cluster of trees there, there was quite a few others there. I forget how many. There must have been close to 10 or 12 all told. And there was some real hobo. Now the hobos are professional bums, you might say, and the so-called tramps are like we were, where you just do it as temporarily or something like that. But the hobos I found were very nice people. And we went there, and they were going to make a supper. And by the way, in these hobo jungles, they have boxes there, old apple boxes and that. And there's dishes in there and pots and pans and everything. And when you're through, you'd better wash up and put it back and have it neat for the next group that comes, because if you don't, they'll track you down, and I'll tell you, you wish you'd cleaned the place up when you left. Anyway, of course, I was only a teenager, as I said, about 17, I think. And so they told this cousin of mine, his name was Clifford, and they gave us a couple of buckets and told us to go and get some water. Others went to bakeries and bummed some day-old bread and stuff. Some went to markets and asked for stuff, and then brought it all back. And they had everything, and they made a nice stew there. And I'll tell you, I can taste that stew today. That, I guess it was because we were so darn hungry, but man, that was the best stew that I've ever eaten in my life. I really enjoyed it. So then they cleaned up everything, and we were waiting for the train to come through, the heading west. And of course, being a young fella, naturally I had new at this. I was nervous, and I'd hear a train whistle, and I'd get up, and I always remember these old hobos. They'd say, pat me on the shoulder and say, take it easy, son, take it easy. And they really knew what was going on, and of course I didn't. But I was pretty eager, and then pretty soon the train came. You could see it, and I got up again, and he again patted me on the shoulder and says, take it easy, son, take it easy. And he knew, of course, that it was going to have to stop up a ways so that we wouldn't have to catch the train on the fly, so to speak. It would stop, and then we could get on easily. And so we did. We finally got on. There's one thing about it I learned. You know, there's these ladder or rungs that on both the front and the back of these freight cars. And you never want to try to grab onto the after rungs of a freight car when it's moving and you're catching it on the fly, because the force, forward motion, everything will whip you around the corner of the freight car into the back, and you don't want that. It'd be hard to hang on that way. You want to catch the front ladder to the car, and then when the force of the motion swings your body around, you hit the side of the car itself, and it's the best way to go. So anyway, we got on there, and we rode, and we got to a place called Glendive, Montana, which is a little town just on the other side of the North Dakota Montana border. And we were going to spend the night there. And it seemed that, of course, that area there is at the end of the so-called Badlands of Dakotas, and an awful lot of rattlesnakes there. It's just infested terrifically with rattlesnakes. And it so happens that once a year, the professional people of the city, doctors, attorneys, lawyers, and so forth, go out and shoot these rattlesnakes and bring them in and string them on a wire in the town square. And it seems to be a kind of a ritual they do. Well, it happened to be that day that they did it, and we went in there, and there was all these rattlesnakes, of course, killed and strung up on this wire in the square. I don't remember for sure now, but I think there must have been 400 or more of them, as I remember it. And, of course, I don't care for snakes, so that didn't do very good. But then we looked around. We found a home that had some rooms and would rent them out. And we went there, and the fellow said, well, he had in the basement, he had a bedroom, and we could have that for 50 cents a piece. So we took it. It was a nice room, and we got to shower and clean up and wash a few of our things out. And then later in the evening, this fella came down, and we visited for quite a while. And of course we talked about the snakes there and everything. And then this basement that we were in, the window, there were a couple of windows there, and they were below the level of the ground. You know, they'd built a little a little area around it, cemented it around, a little hole, I guess you'd say, and then had the window there, so it was below the window, although that let the light in, it was below the street or the ground level. And this guy, I remember, told us that sometimes a rattlesnake will get down there and then it can't get out, and of course it can't get in because the window's closed. But I'll tell you, that didn't do me any good, because at night I spent most of the night staring at that darn window, and of course there was I guess moonlight, and you'd see things like leaves and all that flutter, and you'd imagine it would be a snake. So I didn't put in too good of a night that time. Well, at Glendive we decided to return to Duluth. So we couldn't stay in the railroad yard because of the danger of the railroad bulls or cops catching us. So we started to walk out one of the tracks a ways and thought we'd catch the train out a ways and be free of any of the railroad dicks there, as they call them. And we was walking in between the rails out there. It was just trees and just grass on the sides and everything, and we were about, a block from the highway, running parallel to the road. And we were walking out there ways, and then from the outside, it was a nice day, and from the outside of the rail ahead of us, and I would judge it was probably 50 feet ahead of us, I don't know, up raises a rattlesnake's head. And of course he'd been on the outside of the rail there, laying there, I guess, sunning himself, and feeling our movement coming at him, he raised up. Well, boy, we saw that, and we turned and started to run back, and there was no need of it because we weren't that really close, but it startled us. And this cousin of mine was in front of me, and I ran so fast I ran right up on his back, and we both fell in the middle of the track. And being frightened of the darn snake, we couldn't get up. We couldn't seem to get our footing. And by that time the snake had crawled over and was inside between the rails there. However, as I said, he was, I would imagine, at least 50 feet away. But it sure scared us. So then we went down to the highway and stayed there, and then went back into where we could get took the chance on the railroad cops and got the train back in the regular railroad yards in Glendive. And we returned to Duluth, and then we made a second trip. This time we headed south and went down through Minneapolis, St. Paul, Iowa, and into Missouri. And it was a rather uneventful trip as a general thing, except that there is a place, there are not too many of them, but there's a few places where the trains, between the rails, they have a trough, a cemented trough, 2-3 feet wide and a couple feet deep, and it's filled with water so that these express trains don't have to stop and water up. They can lower kind of a chute they have underneath the engine, and it'll scoop up the water and fill their water tender. Well, this time we were hanging on the back of the water tender itself, between there and the first freight car, and they dropped that and started load, and of course it's a messy thing. Water's coming every place there, all over us. We're just getting soaked, and all we could do was hang on. finally it loaded up the water tender, and they pulled that chute up, which stopped it, but we were soaked there. And we kept on. We went down into Missouri a little bit, and then we returned, headed back. And on going back, we went and grabbed. We couldn't find an open freight car, so we grabbed onto the outside, the rungs of the freight car, and it turned out that this darn train we were on was an express train and didn't make many stops. And I'll tell you, there was not much we could do but hang on, and we got so numb and tired that the only thing we could do was try to work our legs in these ladder rungs, and same with our arms, in such a way that we wouldn't fall off, even we dozed off or something. And it was a miserable trip. I don't remember now how many hours we rode before it stopped and we could get off of that. But it was one miserable trip, that's for sure. And then we returned to Duluth, and that was my extent of my riding the rods, as it said. And looking back at it, it was interesting, but I certainly wouldn't want to do it again.